If you're familiar with the channel here, you're probably well aware of how much of a Batman fan I am. What you may not know is that I'm equally as much of a fan of Frankenstein. I might have mentioned it once or twice here, but I've been a Frankie fan all of my life, and I'll probably be a fan for all of my afterlife as well. My living room is a shrine to this living dead icon. I love the book, I love a lot of the movies, especially the original ones. But even I, as a fan whose love for this franchise borders on the line of obsession, have to admit that there was definitely a gradual decline. The first Frankenstein flick was not only the birth of the dead, but the birth of a franchise. Henry Frankenstein created life from death, and then a lot of death followed. Something that I have to mention before I go into detail here is that a lot of people who aren't familiar with the franchise come to the conclusion that Frankenstein, or more accurately Frankenstein's monster, is just that, a monster. A horror icon who's in the same vein as characters like Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers. But that couldn't be further from the truth. You see, Henry's creation was brought into the world with the body of a man, but essentially the brain of a child. Well, technically he had the brain of somebody abnormal, but you get the picture. He was brought into a universe without any explanation of how it worked, and then shortly thereafter abandoned. This caused the creature to cause chaos simply out of confusion. He had no idea how the world worked, and left to his own devices meant occasional demises. On top of that, the creature was treated pretty cruelly for its formative years. Locked up in captivity, hidden from society, and even denied sunlight. And that's even without mentioning that he was quite literally tortured by Henry's hunchback assistant, threatened by flames for the crime of existing. And it definitely didn't help matters that when he was in the public, he was regarded as being grotesque, being treated as a monster before he ever got the chance to be a man. The first movie is absolutely heartbreaking. And what's even more confusing is that for some reason, Henry is hailed as a hero that the audience is supposed to root for, when in spite of that, it could be argued that he was the real Frankenstein's monster. But make no mistake, Henry isn't exactly evil. He's not necessarily a bad guy, but in terms of the story, he could very well be seen as the bad guy. He's depicted as a classic mad scientist who put his own need for scientific success over ethics.
Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
He never cared about the quality of life his creation would have, just that he could create life himself.
I create life!
Though luckily, it seemed like he learned his lesson after his creation's demise, which is why the character of Dr. Pretorius was created, who is Henry's former mentor, who set him on the path that he's currently on. So when it came time for the second movie, this time around he was the resident mad scientist. And Henry is made into a much more sane, reasonable version of himself, coming across much more like a protagonist than he had previously. And I think this was done very intentionally. This was an effort to make Henry more of a hero, and justify his status as a good guy. Which is something that almost works, if you just decide to forget the entire first movie. Pretorius tries to persuade his former protege into creating a mate for his monster, but Henry takes the high road and decides against it. That is until the bad doctor enlists the monster's aid in convincing Henry. Despite the ending of the last film, the monster is still very much alive, and actually has some interesting developments this time around. For starters, Frankenstein finally makes a friend, this time in an old blind man. A friend who winds up becoming a bit of a teacher to him, teaching the monster how to smoke and speak. Though unfortunately this friendship is short-lived, as Frankenstein, unsurprisingly, winds up being chased away by some villagers. Pretorius finds him maybe at his most vulnerable, and enlists him in forcing Henry to follow through with his next experiment, that being a bride for the beast. Now, another misconception that I gotta bring up here is that very often these two are portrayed as being an iconic horror couple. I know that even I, for one, own a bunch of merchandise that would make you think so. But again, that couldn't be further from the truth. Because when the bride sees her would-be husband, she reacts the same way that everyone else does. In fear. There is no romance to speak of here. And just like that, the monster's one chance of a happy existence, a happy ending, is taken from him. realizing that he's truly all alone. Even those who were specifically made to love him are unable to. It's at this point the monster takes his own life, intentionally saving his creator and his bride, but ending his own and his would-be brides, as well as the bad scientist. And wouldn't you know it, that would be the first and last time we ever see the bride in this line of films. For as iconic as the design has become, the actual character had maybe all of 5 minutes of screen time. Now the next Frankenstein movie is where things start to take a turn. Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein were two movies that were married to each other. Ironically, they feel like two halves of the same story, and that could be for a couple of reasons. For one, they're the only two movies in this line of films that actually take concepts from the original book. But both of these back-to-back films were also directed by James Whale. So the vision is very much intact in these two movies, and that's why the sequel feels like a proper continuation of the first. However, Son of Frankenstein does things a little differently, though that's not necessarily a complaint. Son of Frankenstein had a new director and a new direction, taking an alternate route, instead turning its star and somewhat titular character into a prop of the plot. For one, the monster can no longer speak for reasons unknown on screen, but behind the scenes, it's because Boris Karloff, the actor who portrayed the monster, felt that allowing him to talk was a bit of a mistake, which, in hindsight, I can see where he's coming from, but I don't know if I agree entirely. I will say making him speak as often and as much as he did in that film might not have been the best call. Karloff's performance early on was so strong because without saying a word, you knew everything he was going through at any given minute. He emoted and articulated strictly from his eyes. His incredible facial expressions is enough to elicit sadness and sorrow out of any first-time viewer. Before anybody tries to come at me in the comments, yes, I know the book is considerably different. The monster speaks full-on sentences there, but I think the movies and the book kinda exist as their own separate entities. And I kind of agree that this Frankenstein's monster didn't need to speak to get his point across. He articulated himself perfectly without ever having to open his mouth. But also, on the other hand, having said that, I didn't mind the occasional grunt or word here and there, though full-blown speech probably wasn't the best idea in the long run, which is why it was short-lived. The truth of the matter is that Frankenstein's monster doesn't do a lot in this film. Actually, he's mostly there just to kickstart the plot. The narratives surround him specifically, of course, but I don't know that he himself is so much playing into it. And that could sound like a downgrade on paper, but I think it actually works incredibly well, because Henry Frankenstein's creation is problematic simply by existing. He really just acts as a catalyst between the movie's real main protagonist and antagonist. And speaking of which, this movie's greatest strength is all of the new characters that the plot introduces. Characters that I would argue are some of the greatest and most iconic of the entire series. After all, it's this movie specifically that inspired the spoof Mel Brooks made in Young Frankenstein, with a lot of this cast being parodied. As Henry's actor Colin Clive had passed away by this point in time, the decision was made to follow his never-before-seen or spoken-of son, Baron Wolf von Frankenstein. Basil Rathbone was asked to step into the role, and he really made it work, feeling like a mostly normal man who becomes obsessed with his father's works beyond his better judgment. He's essentially driven mad as time goes on, going from a loving husband to a devout scientist, something he never intended to be. And of course, he's led down that path by Igor. Now, yet another great misconception of these movies is that Igor is Henry Frankenstein's hunchback assistant. But that's not true, because that character goes by the name of Fritz. Igor is actually a much more menacing and maniacal character, who never so much as shared the screen with the first Doctor. There's actually a whole lot more to this debacle, but I think I want to address that in a video of its own somewhere down the line. And if you'd be interested in seeing that, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying, Igor. Here, Igor is played to perfection by Bela Lugosi, who is probably most famous for portraying Count Dracula, a portrayal that has been attempted to be duplicated to no avail time and time again. But I would even argue that his acting here is even greater than his acting there. For me personally, Igor is Bela's greatest role. He is so eerily unnerving and unsettling every time he's on screen. Oh, and by the way, That's not a hunchback. His neck is actually broken because he survived a hanging. And since he was pronounced dead at the scene, it seems like there's nothing the courts can do to stop him now. Which is why this living dead man befriends the other living dead man, manipulating the monster with friendship in an attempt to get him to do his bidding, having the monster get back at the men who should have ended his life. Then there's Inspector Crow, a man whose arm was pulled out of its socket as a boy when he first encountered the monster. He spends his days watching over the son of Frankenstein, trying to dismay him from following in his father's footsteps, which he inevitably does. Yet despite this, he doesn't treat Wolf too poorly. He doesn't blame the young Frankenstein for his own situation. He doesn't act out of revenge or resentment. He just remains incredibly cautious and weary, and meets the soon-to-be mad scientist with compassion and concern, not just for him but for his family, especially for his son, who isn't much older than he was when he had that first encounter with the monster. It makes for a really compelling story. And even though it's a detour from the first two films, it's not a departure in terms of quality, which I cannot say for the follow-up films. Ghost of Frankenstein is where things take another turn, this time for the worse. Boris Karloff felt that he was aging out of the role, and that the monster had become more of a prop than a character, which he kind of was. So he forfeited the part to Lon Chaney Jr., the man who famously played the Wolfman. And while Chaney did a good enough job, it just never felt the same as when Karloff had played him. It came across like a basic impression with none of the nuances or substance that made that original character work. He tried his best, but the best that you could say for it was that it was fine. It's probably one of the better monster interpretations following Boris Karloff's exit from the role, but even in saying that, it still misses the mark from what Karloff achieved. The movie also has a bunch of flaws. Characters who were previously killed off in the last installment are suddenly back from the dead for seemingly no reason, and the movie recycles a lot of what made the other films work, but to significantly less success. The monster befriends a little girl, the villagers freak, Igor uses the monster to do his bidding, the movie follows Henry Frankenstein's never-before-heard-of other son and his family. It just feels incredibly cheap creatively. Like there's no more story to tell here, but they're still gonna try anyway. It's a mostly forgettable film, maybe with the exception of Bela Lugosi once again stealing the show as Igor. It doesn't bring anything new to the table, and I would even argue that Bela's past performance as the character was a bit stronger. Everything in this movie was taken from much better movies in the same line of movies, and those were movies that did these things much better. Even the naming convention of this movie feels incredibly cheap, as it refers to a quick scene that seemed like it was only in the script to set up the naming convention of the movie itself, where the ghost of Henry Frankenstein comes to his second son in his dream, and is very noticeably not Henry Frankenstein, because the actual actor was a ghost at this point in time, but rather the actor who is portraying his son in this movie. I can't be angry that they didn't resurrect a man from the dead, but I can be angry that you resurrected a dead character. I think the most interesting aspect of this movie comes from its ending, when the brain of Igor is transferred into the monster, causing him to speak once again, this time with Igor's voice. And it is not good. It is laughably bad, which I guess is a step up from a movie that up until this point in time had been blatantly bland and boring. This would be the last of the solo Frankenstein outings, with the next few films instead showcasing the monster as part of a team-up or beat-up, starting with Frankenstein Meets The Wolfman, a movie which saw Frankenstein meet the Wolfman. Bela Lugosi returns this time around as Frankenstein, who now has Igor's brain in him. And this was done to keep some sense of continuity, despite the fact that the canon is just all over the place. The time period doesn't make sense because the Wolfman was modern times back then and Frankenstein clearly wasn't. But it also doesn't add anything to the movie itself, because unfortunately when test audiences heard Frankenstein's monster speak with the voice of Igor, they couldn't help but laugh, leading to all of his lines getting cut out of the movie, including lines that would explain a lot of the plot and explain why the monster was walking around in that signature Frankenstein pose. Yeah, his hands are only out like that in this one film, because he's supposed to be blind. But you would never know that because it's not actually included in the final film. But yeah, that's where the classic Frankenstein walk comes from. This one movie. He does it this one time. And for those of you at home listening to this, just to keep track, at this point in time, the part of Frankenstein has been played by the Mummy, Boris Karloff, the Wolfman, Lon Chaney Jr., and now Dracula, Bela Lugosi. The movie is an absolute mangled mess, and it definitely doesn't feel like a follow-up to the Frankenstein film that came before it, or the classic Wolfman movie that was pretty fresh at the time. In my opinion, it does a disservice to both brands. But it was still successful enough to spawn an entire line of crossovers. And I get it. There's some novelty in seeing these two major Universal icons meet and brawl. Even if that brawl is really more like a... I don't even have anything to compare it to, just this. This was a major moment in crossovers between brands, sort of setting the tone for many of the crossovers in cinematic universes that we'd see on the big screen today. But outside of its historical significance, the movie itself falls short of the mark. I can't imagine this being anybody's favorite Wolfman movie, and I definitely can't imagine this being anyone's favorite Frankenstein movie. And while there are another 2 to 3 films in this Universal series that star Frankenstein, he becomes more and more of a prop, making the monster feel less special with each new installment. I do want to talk about those movies specifically. They sort of set the precedent for cinematic universes in general, but I feel like they belong being spoken of in a video of their own. So if you enjoyed this video, and would maybe want to see me tackle the rest of the Universal horror movies, whether that be in a long-form video or individually installment by installment, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Frankenstein, you know Frankenstein, don't you?
I am vengeance. I am the night. And that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.